Welcome to Vue Mastery's Intro to Vue 3 course. We're going to take a journey through the Vue universe to explore the technology and build a solid foundation of Vue skills so we can build upon that to head towards Vue Mastery. This course is your first step along the way, and on our platform we have a whole library of courses you can take. Now let's take a look at the app we're going to be building throughout this course. As you can see, we're going to be building a product page. When we click the Add to Cart button, we can add the product to our cart. And when we hover our mouse over these colors, we can change the image. And you'll see one of our products is out of stock, and we're disabling the button so we can't add that one to the cart. If we scroll down here, you'll see we have a form where we can add reviews. So we'll learn the basics of building forms with Vue, and by the end of the course, we'll understand the fundamentals of how to build a Vue app. To get the most out of this course, you're going to want to be coding along. You're going to want to head over to our repo, clone the project, and then from there you can switch between different branches for the starting and ending code for each lesson. For example, in the next lesson, lesson 2, you can check out L2-start or L2-end for the starting and ending code respectively. Throughout this course, you're going to see me using VS Code, and I do recommend that for Vue development. But if you already have a code editor of your choice, you can stick with that one. And finally, at the end of each lesson, you'll see a coding challenge so you can put the concepts into practice. Now, if you're ready, let's create our first Vue app in the next lesson. As we get started learning Vue, we'll want to get familiar with how to create our projects. In the Vue ecosystem, the most common way to do this is to use a CLI program to generate the new app called Create Vue. We do this from the terminal using this command, npm init vue my Vue app. My Vue app is the name of our project. We'll go through a series of questions asked by Create Vue. You can choose no for all of them. Although JSX support is available for Vue.js, the standard way to write a Vue.js template is still using the Vue.js template syntax, which we'll get to in the coming lessons. Because Vue.js is a framework, it provides all the tools for your basic web development needs. You can use Pinia for state management, use Vue Router for your routing needs, etc. But this course is going to be about the core Vue.js features, so we won't get into Pinia and Vue Router here. If you want to learn about Pinia or Vue Router or TypeScript for Vue.js, you can check out the Vue Mastery courses on these topics. After generating the project, we can cd into it, run npm install to install all of the necessary dependencies, and npm run dev to spin up the development server and view our app on a local host. You probably noticed that the server got ready pretty quick. That's because the app is powered by Vite instead of Webpack. The main feature of Vite is performance. The app can now be opened in a code editor such as VS Code, which is recommended for Vue.js development, and we can customize it from there. Learning how to create apps from scratch with the CLI is an essential skill for Vue developers. But for this course, you'll be following along with and building the app we've already designed. So please head to the course repo and clone it to get started. Each lesson includes both starting and ending code to make the learning experience smooth and flexible. You can clone the project using the GitHub CLI or the standard HTTPS method. If you choose HTTPS, just make sure you have a GitHub personal access token set up. GitHub no longer supports password-based authentication when cloning via HTTPS. If you're not sure what that is, you can follow the GitHub guide to create one quickly. Using the GitHub CLI, I'll open my terminal and navigate to where I want to clone the repo, such as my Documents folder, then run gh repo clone, and then the name of the repo. This will clone the repo locally to my computer. Now I can cd into it and run code to open the project in VS Code. If that doesn't work, you can install the VS Code shell command by following the instructions in the lesson text. With the project open in VS Code, we'll want to open the native terminal by typing Ctrl+backtick. Inside here, we'll run npm install to install the necessary dependencies. If you're curious, inside of the package.json, you can see what the dependencies of this project are, which are very concise. It's basically just Vue and Vite, and a Vite plugin for Vue to make them work together. For production-level projects with more libraries and resources, we'd see a lot more dependencies here. Notice how we're on the main branch of this repo. As I mentioned earlier, we've designed this repo to have separate branches for each lesson, with starting and ending code for each. So to access this starting code for this lesson, lesson 2, we'll we'll run git checkout L2 start. Now that we're on the correct branch, let's get acquainted with the code for our project. Inside of the src folder, you'll find all of the application code. Notice this app.vue file. This is our main top-level component in which all other files will be nested. If we take a look inside of the main.js file, you can see that it acts as the starting point for everything by using the createApp method from Vue to take that app file and everything nested within it, applying styles from our main CSS located in the assets directory, and mounting the app. Where is it mounting the app exactly? We can see #app. Where does that exist? Looking inside index.html, we can find a div with the ID of app, which is exactly where the app component will be mounted to. In case you're unfamiliar with the term, mounting simply means that Vue inserts the app into the main HTML file of the app, the one loaded in your browser, so you can see it on the screen. Speaking of which, let's head into the terminal and type npm run dev, which will spin up the dev server and launch our project on a local host so we can view our app running live in the browser. If all is working, we'll see a white page with that h1's content from app.vue, socks. Heading back into app.vue, we can see that there are two distinct parts of a Vue component, the script part and the template part. Optionally, there's a style part for your CSS code, but for now, let's just focus on the script and the template. You can think of the template as the skeleton, giving the component its structure, while the script functions as the brains, where we place the logic and functionality. Notice this setup attribute here. This is compile time syntactic sugar for using the composition API in single file components, reducing boilerplate by streamlining how you declare state and logic. Instead of just displaying this hard-coded sock string in the h1, let's add some data to our script and then dynamically display it in our template. We'll import ref from Vue and use it to initialize a piece of state. As you can see, we're creating a constant called product using Vue's ref function, and we're passing it a string, socks. So what does that actually mean? You can think of ref like a special box that holds a value. Right now, we've put socks inside that box. Vue keeps an eye on it, and whenever the value inside changes, anything in the app that uses it will automatically update. That's what makes ref special. It creates a reactive variable that works inside Vue's reactivity system. Now, to actually render this ref, we'll use double curly braces in the template to create a binding. Now we will see the value of product, socks, displayed in the browser. Before, we were seeing text hard-coded inside the template. Now we're seeing a piece of data from our script. And if that data changes from socks to boots, for example, we'll see that change reflected in the browser. By using a ref inside of our template, like we did inside the h1, we have essentially created a direct line of communication between our template and script, between the HTML and the JavaScript. You can visualize this funny-looking double curly brace syntax in the template like phones, which are able to call up the ref itself and ask it for its value. Then voila, the template is able to render that string in the browser. Whenever that ref's value changes, Vue's reactivity system automatically takes care of updating our templates, i.e. updating the DOM for us. If this double curly brace syntax, also called mustache syntax, is new to you, it allows us to write JavaScript expressions inside our template. In other words, it allows us to run valid JavaScript within our HTML. It can be harnessed for various use cases, such as concatenating strings, ternary operators, running methods on our data, and so much more. We've reached the end of this lesson, which brings us to the first coding challenge. Add a product description ref to your script section. Display the description using an expression within a p tag. As a reminder, if you're coding along with our repo, you can check out the ending code as well. So for this one, it would be L2-end. In this lesson, we're going to look at the concept of attribute binding. Let's get started. If you're coding along with this repo, you can open up your terminal and say git checkout L3-start. This is going to pull up the starting code for this lesson. You'll see we now have more divs within our template. And in this lesson, we're going to be focusing on this div with the class of product image. Inside here, you'll see this comment that says image goes here. So we're going to look at using attribute binding to display an image here. Once we get this to work, we're going to be displaying the image right here within our app. Remember that in our assets directory, we have this folder with these images. So in order to target one of those images, we're going to import the image directly using the file path of the image. Now we're ready to add an image element here. In the source attribute, we'll say sock screen image. We want to be pulling in the path of the image, much like we pulled in the product data in the H1 below using that expression. So the question here is, how do we bind the attribute src to the sock screen image variable? To do that, we're going to say v-bind and then colon. This is the vbind directive. Now we've created a bond between what lives in this attribute and this variable. So now looking in the browser, we see our image display. Currently, the image tag is bound to this sock screen image variable, which is not a reactive variable. vbind is only useful when the source is reactive. Let's create a new reactive variable using ref with the sock screen image variable and bind our image tag to the image ref. This might not seem like a big difference right now, but this reactive setup is crucial for implementing more reactive features in future lessons of this course. So let's understand how vbind works. We use vbind to dynamically bind an attribute to an expression. In this case, the attribute is src, and the expression is here in the quotes. So we've created this bond between the attribute and the value of the expression. If you're thinking to yourself, this doesn't look like a JavaScript expression, you can imagine it looking like this. Because underneath the hood, Vue is going to evaluate this just the same. So when we say image here, Vue knows that we're referring to the image ref. And when our app renders, the expression essentially asks the Vue app, what is the value of image? It evaluates to that image path, allowing us to pull in and display that image. And because of Vue's reactivity system, if we updated this to the blue image, the expression that our source attribute is bound to would update, and our browser would display the new image. Using vbind to bind to attributes like this is super common. So common that there is this shorthand for vbind, and it's just the colon, like so. And as you can imagine, since there's so many different HTML attributes, there's a lot of use cases for vbind. For example, you might be binding a description to an alt attribute, binding a URL to an href, binding some dynamic styles to a class or style attribute, disabling a button with vbind, and so on. So now we've reached the end of the lesson and on to our second challenge. Add a URL ref. Then use vbind to bind that URL to an anchor tag's href attribute. As a reminder, if you're coding along with our repo, you can check out the ending code as well. So for this one, it would be L3-end. In this lesson, we're going to look at conditional rendering. Specifically, we're going to want to be displaying in stock or out of stock depending upon a condition, whether this product is in stock or not. If you're coding along, you can check out to this branch, which is L4-start. So in our code, we're going to add a p tag that says in stock, and another that says out of stock. Again, we only want one of these to show up depending on if our product is in stock or not. So we'll head into the data and add a new in-stock ref, which is going to be a Boolean. We'll initialize that to true. Over on the p tag, we're going to use a new directive, the vif directive. So we'll say vif equals in stock, and on the second p tag, we're going to say velse. This is probably pretty self-explanatory, but here we're saying if in stock is true, show the first p tag, otherwise, or velse, show the second p tag. And because in stock is currently true, we're going to show the first one. So looking at this in the browser, we're displaying in stock. Great. And to make sure this is working, we'll change in stock to false, which should cause our second p tag to display. And there it is, just as expected. It's worth noting here that you don't always need to pair a vif with a velse. If you have just one element that you want to be displaying or not, you could just say vif on that element. You don't need a fallback element with v_else beneath it. So here, if our in-stock data value is true, we're going to be displaying that p tag. Another way to accomplish this same behavior is to use vShow. This is used for toggling an element's visibility. Instead of adding and removing the element from the DOM like vIf does, vShow simply toggles the element's visibility. So as you can imagine, this is the more performant option if you have something that's toggling off and on the screen often, like a modal, for example. So since in_stock is true, our element is visible. But let's look at what happens when in_stock is false in this case. In the DevTools, I've highlighted the p tag. See how now we have this inline style, display none. So really the element hasn't gone anywhere. It was just hidden with that style that vShow added to it. So we just looked at the differences between vIf and vShow. Earlier we looked at vIf with vElse. Now let's take a look at how we can add additional layers of conditional logic. To do this, I'm going to change in_stock to inventory, and instead of a Boolean, let's make it an integer and set it to 100. Now we can say if inventory is greater than 10, show in_stock. And just to make sure this is working, we are indeed showing in_stock, so far so good. Now I want to show you how we can add those additional layers of logic in between here. So if I add a new p tag that says almost sold out, I can add the directive vElse if, and in this expression, I'll say if inventory is less than or equal to 10 and inventory is greater than 0, in that condition, we want to display almost sold out. Otherwise, if inventory is 0, show out of stock. To demo this, I'll put 8, which is less than 10 and greater than 0. And in the browser, we'll see almost sold out. And of course, if inventory is 0, we'll default to the final level of vElse and display out of stock. Perfect. To make this conditional logic a little more concrete, I like to envision it like this, where we've got this ball that stops at the level that evaluates to true. So if inventory is 100, that's greater than 10, so we stop at the first level. But as soon as inventory turns to something less than or equal to 10 and greater than 0, such as 8, we stop at the middle level. And finally, when inventory is 0, our ball of truth falls down to the final level. So that brings us to the end of this concept and to our coding challenge. Create an on-sale Boolean ref, then use that to conditionally render a p tag that says on sale whenever on sale is true. And a reminder, if you want to check out the ending code for this lesson, you'll want to go to L4-end. See you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to look at rendering lists within the Vue app. If we check out the starting code, which you can access if you're following along at L5-start, we'll see that we now have this array of details. So the question now is, how do we display details as a list? So we'll create an unordered list. And on this li inside of it, we're going to add another Vue directive. This is the v_for directive. And inside this expression, we'll say detail in details, referring to the details ref in our script. And in the inner HTML, we'll add an expression and say detail, so that we can print out each detail or each element from the details array. If we check this out in the browser, we can see that we're rendering our list. But how is v_for actually working? Well, as you might imagine, v_for works like a for loop. Again, on this li element, we added the v_for directive. So here in the expression, we're specifying what we want to loop over. In this case, we're looping over details. This is the collection that we're iterating over. And detail is the alias for the element at the given time of that iteration. And we're printing out each detail as we loop through. So it's kind of like v_for functions like a conveyor belt for looping over and printing out your data, taking each element from your array and rendering it out accordingly. Now that we have a better understanding of how v4 works, let's look at another example within our app. In this case, now we have a variants array, and we have an object for each variant of our product. Each product has an ID and a color. So for our next task, we're going to print out each variant color. So we'll add a div, and then say v4 variant, that's the alias, in variants, the collection that we're iterating over, and then in the inner HTML, use an expression that says variant.color. So if we check this out in the browser, we should now see two divs, one with the string green, one with blue. So refreshing the browser, awesome, it works. It's worth noting here that when you're creating lists like this with v4, you're going to want to give each list item a unique key. So let's look at setting the key attribute on our div. We'll use the shorthand for vbind on the key attribute and set that equal to variant.id. This gives each DOM element a unique key so that Vue can essentially grasp onto the element and not lose track of it as things update and change within your app. This provides us some performance improvements, and also later down the line, if you're doing something like animating your elements, you'll find that the key attribute is really helpful with things like that. So that's it for this lesson on list rendering, and now for our coding challenge. Add an array of sizes as a ref, then use v4 to display them in a list. As always, you can check out the ending code at L5-end. In this lesson, we're going to look at event handling within a Vue app. If you're coding along, you can check out the L6-start branch. In that new starting code, you'll see that we now have an add cart button along with a cart. So you're probably able to guess what we're about to do in this lesson. We want to be able to click that button and add this item to the cart. So let's make that happen. Looking at the code, you can see we have this div for the cart, and it's using an expression to print out the value of cart from our data. And if we scroll down, we can find the button. We want to add the ability to be able to listen for events on this button, specifically click events. So how do we get that to happen? Well, you might not be surprised that we're going to use another Vue directive. This time, this one is called vOn. And we can pass this directive an argument that specifies the event we're listening for. And in the expression, this is the logic that we're triggering when that event happens. In this case, we're incrementing our cart by a value of 1. So let's check out this behavior in the browser. As we click on the button, we're incrementing the value of cart, which we can see displayed in real time. Currently, the logic inside of our vOn expression is very simple, so we could keep it in line like so. But often, we need to trigger more complex logic, so in those situations, we can add a method name to fire when that event happens. So we'll switch this out for a function that we'll write soon. And inside our script, we'll add the add to cart function. This function will have just one line. We'll say cart.value, referring to this cart within our data, and increment the value of that cart with plus equals 1. This function contains the same logic we just had in line. The difference here is now we're using cart.value to refer to the value of the cart. In the template, we don't have to use .value to refer to the value of a ref, but in the script, we have to add .value. In the browser, we're seeing the same behavior, but now it's all encapsulated within that method. Let's take a deeper look into how this event handling is working. So by adding vOn to an element, we're essentially giving it a listener or an ear that can listen for events. In this case, we've specified that we're listening for click events. And when that event happens, we want the add to cart function to run, which, as we just saw, takes the value of cart and increments it by 1. As you can imagine, listening for events on your elements is super common. So just like how vbind had a shorthand, vOn has a shorthand too. And it's just the @ symbol, like so. Now that we understand the basics of event handling, let's listen for another kind of event within our Vue app. Currently, we're printing out the variant colors green and blue. But wouldn't it be nice if when we hovered over green and blue, we triggered an update of the image to the green and blue image, respectively? So let's implement this feature where we listen for hover events on our variant divs. Because we want to update the image that we're displaying when we hover on the variant colors, I've added a new property to each variant object. Now each variant has an image path for the green and blue socks respectively. And this new image is imported up here. So on that div, we'll use the shorthand for @on and say @mouseover, which is the Vue version of hover. And when that event happens, we want to run a method to update our image. And we'll feed that method the variant image using dot notation. Now we can add that function in the script and set a parameter of variant image. Because inside this function, we'll say image.value and set that equal to the variant image that we just passed in. Now in the browser, when we hover over the green and blue string, we're seeing the green and blue image. And with that, we've come to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Create a new button that decrements the value of cart. As always, you can check out the ending code at L6-end. In this lesson, we're going to learn about class and style binding. Let's get started. If you're coding along, you can check out the L7-start branch. In the last lesson, we added the feature where if you hover over the green and blue div, you update the variant image. But wouldn't the user experience be just a little bit nicer if instead of hovering over the word green and blue, we hovered over the actual color green and blue? So the question is, how can we show the variant colors themselves using style binding? Before we get that style binding working, however, I'm going to add a new class to this variant div. That class is going to be called ColorCircle. And if we look at that class in our CSS file, we'll see that it essentially styles our div as a 50 by 50 pixeled circle. Now that the div is starting to look how we want it to, we can move on to the actual style binding, where we use the color name to set the background color of this div. So back in VS Code, I'm going to use the shorthand for vbind on this style attribute, and in the expression, I'm going to add a style object. Like I said, we're going to update the background color and set that equal to the variant color. Now looking in the browser, instead of displaying just those color names, we're displaying the actual colors. Cool, so now that that is working, let's understand on a deeper level how this is all working under the hood. On our div, we added the style attribute and bound a style object to it. That style object has the CSS property of background color, and we're setting that equal to whatever the variant color is at the time of that v4 iteration. So in the first iteration, variant.color is green. So Vue takes that information and converts it into the code style equals background color, green, and prints out the green background circle. In the next loop, variant color evaluates to blue. So Vue prints out a blue background circle. Pretty simple. There's some important things to consider when using style binding like this. So remember, we're within an object here. Inside of this expression, remember that this style object is all JavaScript. So that's why I used camel case in this property name. If I had said background-color, because we're in JavaScript, that would have been interpreted as a minus sign, but we're not doing any math here. We're setting a CSS property name. So our options are either camel cased, or alternatively, we could use kebab case, but we have to put that property name within quotes like so. Sometimes you might want to add a bunch of styles, but adding that all inline could get messy. So in situations like those, we could bind to an entire object that lives within our script, including all those styles within there. So in this case, when this renders, we would have added each property from this style object within our data. Back in our app, you'll notice that when our in-stock value is false, we can still add the item to the cart. But if the item is out of stock, maybe we don't even want the user to be able to add it to the cart. So let's change up the behavior here. Let's make the button disabled whenever in stock is false. To get this feature started, we'll use the shorthand for vbind on the disabled attribute and add that attribute whenever our product is not in stock. In other words, whenever in stock is false. Now, because in stock is false, the button is disabled, so when we click it, we're not running that add to cart method. But the button still looks clickable, so let's use class binding to add a disabled button class. You'll see in our CSS file that we have this disabled button class, which sets the background color to gray and makes the cursor not allowed. So we're going to use class binding to conditionally add this class whenever in stock is false. We'll use the shorthand for vbind on the class attribute and pass in an object which includes the class name that we want to add whenever our product is not in stock. Now, because in stock is false, not only is this button disabled, but it also appears to be disabled. When getting started with class binding, there are some things to note. For example, what happens when we already have an existing class, such as color circle, and we wanted to conditionally add an active class based on the truthiness of active class within our script? Let's look at this example. In the class binding here, active is the class name, and active class is really a condition that we're evaluating to determine if we're adding the active class or not. So because active class in our script is true, we're going to add the class of active to this div. At this point, you might be wondering what's going to happen here because we already have the color circle class and we're adding another class, the active class. How does that look? Well, when this actually renders out, those classes are going to be combined like so. A helpful tool that class binding gives you is the ability to use inline ternary operators. So here we can use this array syntax and add the active class whenever isActive is true. Otherwise, we could add an entirely different class or none at all. In this case, because isActive is true, we are indeed adding the active class. The variations in syntax and use cases that I just showed you with class and style binding is only the start, so I do recommend checking out the Vue docs for more use cases and examples. For now, this brings us to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Bind the out-of-stock image class to the image whenever in-stock is false. You can find this lesson's ending code at the L7 end branch. In this lesson, we're going to learn about the concept of computed properties. Let's get started. If you're coding along, you can check out the L8 start branch, and you'll notice we have a new const, a brand of Vue Mastery. Now, what if we wanted to combine the brand and the product in our template? For example, here in the expression within the H1, we could say brand plus a space plus product. And if we check that out in the browser, we'll see Vue Mastery socks displayed. But wouldn't it be neat if our app had the ability to compute that value for us? For example, taking the brand and the product, adding them together, and returning that new value. Well, these are the kind of things that computed properties allow us to do. So now let's encapsulate this behavior inside of a computed property. So we'll cut out this logic here and replace it for the word title. This will be the name of a new computed property that we'll add up here. Create a computed property called title. And inside of here, it's going to return brand.value plus a space plus product.value. Since we're using the computed function from the Vue.js framework, we have to import it up here. Now heading into the browser, we still see Vue Mastery socks, except now that value was calculated for us by a computed property. But how exactly are computed properties working? Let's take a deeper look. I like to think of computed properties kind of like a calculator because they calculate or compute values for us. In this case, it's computing the value of brand plus a space plus product. That, of course, equals Vue Mastery socks. And a benefit of computed properties is that they cache the value, so it stores it away and only updates when it needs to, when one of its dependencies change. For example, if the brand were to change from Vue Mastery to Node Mastery, our computed property would receive that new dependency, then recalculate and return the new value. Looking back at our app so far, we're updating the variant image based off of which color circle we're currently hovered on. But what if each variant had a different quantity? For example, one could be in stock and the other could be out of stock. We really should be updating whether we're displaying in stock and out of stock based on the variant's quantity. So let's head into our code and make that happen. To review, when we mouse over these variant divs, we're updating the image based off of one of these image paths in our variant. And as you'll see, each variant now has a quantity, and our green socks have 50 while the blue socks have 0. In other words, the blue socks are out of stock. So let's refactor our code so we're updating the image and in stock with computed properties. When the mouse over event happens, we're now going to trigger a new method called updateVariant. And it's going to take in the index. To get access to the index, we'll pass it in as a second parameter in our v4, like so. Now, in our script, we're going to remove image, and instead we'll use selectedVariant. And we'll initialize it as 0, because we're going to update this with the index of the variant that's currently hovered on. We'll also delete out inStock, because again, both inStock and image are now going to be computed properties. But first, we're going to change updateImage to updateVariant, which takes in the index of the currently hovered on variant, and set selectedVariant.value equal to that index. To test to make sure this is working, we're going to console log index. If we check this out in the browser, as we hover over these variant color circles, in the console, we'll see their index is logged, 0 and 1 respectively. Also, notice that we have these warning messages. Property image was accessed during render but is not defined on instance. So what is this referring to? Well, here is where our image is supposed to be showing, because in our template we have this image element and its source attribute is bound to image. But remember, we just deleted image from our data, hence the warning that it's not defined on the instance. And now we're going to replace image and inStock with a computed property. So back in our code, we're going to clean out this console log. And here we'll add the image computed property, which returns variance.value. And we'll target the first or second one using selectedVariant.value, which again is the index. So 0 would target the first one and 1 targets the second one. Now we can simply use dot notation to grab the image of these variants. We'll do the same thing for inStock, which also returns variance.value, targeting the selected variant and grabbing its quantity. And make sure quantity is greater than 0. Checking this out in the browser, when we hover over the color circles, not only are we updating the variant image, but we're also displaying whether that variant is in stock or out of stock using its quantity. And if you're wondering how this is automatically updating for us, where the out of stock and in stock is toggling and the button is enabling and disabling, that's because in our template, we're still using in stock. Now, in stock is not a ref, it's a computed property. And with that, we've come to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Add an on-sale Boolean ref, then use a computed property to display the string brand plus product is on sale, whenever on sale is true. To access the ending code, you can check out L8-end. In this lesson, we're going to look at components and props. In modern front-end JavaScript frameworks, components are the building blocks of an app, and that's certainly the case with Vue. You can imagine them a bit like Legos that you can plug into each other in this component hierarchy, which, when rendered, creates your application like so. Looking at this website, for example, this website may be composed of multiple components. And a given component may actually be a parent component, meaning it has child components nested within it, like so. So let's head into our application and create our first component. If you're coding along, you can check out the L9-start branch. Because our app will have multiple components, we'll create a components folder, inside of which we'll create our first component called productDisplay.Vue. We'll copy the script and the template from the app component. Head into app.vue to grab all of this product-related template code. We'll leave the nav bar and the cart here because these are not component-specific. Heading back into product display, we'll put the product display template here. We still need the refs, functions, and computed properties. Those still live in the app component. So we'll copy this here and paste it into our product display component. We'll just delete cart here because we don't need each product to have its own cart. That needs to be a global thing that's separate from our product component. Since this component is inside the components folder, we have to modify the image paths. Or better yet, we can just use the absolute path syntax. Remove all of these refs except cart. Remove the computed properties and functions. Also remove the image imports. And finally, the computed import, leaving just the ref. Now we'll import the product display component. We'll go into our components directory and grab the product display component. Now that it's imported, we can use it within our template. If we check this out in the browser, you can see all of that code is still showing up just like it was before. But now, since we've rearranged things, that button is no longer adding to the cart. We'll fix that in the next lesson. For now, to show you how helpful these reusable blocks of code can be, I'm going to paste 2 more product display components, and we'll see them all showing up, each of which are independently functional. Now that we're starting to learn how to encapsulate reusable code into these components, what happens when our component needs something that is outside of itself? For example, what if the parent had this message data and the child needed it? Because a component has its own isolated scope, it can't reach up outside of itself to grab something that's outside of its scope. So the answer here is props. These are custom attributes for passing data into a component. They function kind of like a funnel, into which you can pass the data that component needs. Let's add the ability for our product display component to take in a prop. If our app component had a new ref premium, which indicated whether the user was a premium user or not, we can add a premium prop to our product display component so that it can receive that value. We'll create a props variable using the define props function, specifying we're expecting a premium prop. And we can even set some prop validation, specifying that premium is of type Boolean and is required. Now that we've configured this, we can add that custom attribute onto the component where we're using it. We'll write premium, which functions like a funnel, where we can pass in that premium data to the product display component. And we'll use the shorthand for vbind so we can reactively receive the new value of premium as it updates. Now that our product display component is taking in the premium prop, we can make use of it within the component. We'll create a new computed property called shipping. It will check if the user is premium. If so, it will return the string free. Otherwise, it will return $2.99. And in the template, we'll add a new p tag that says shipping, and then in an expression, we'll say shipping. Checking this out in the browser, because premium is true, we're showing shipping free. Awesome, it's working. To double check, we'll change premium to false, which now triggers shipping to display $2.99. And with that brings us to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Create a new component called product details, which receives the details through a prop called details. You can check out the ending code at L9-end. In this lesson, we're going to look at communicating events that happen within our components. When we refactored things in our last lesson, we broke this behavior. Now, because the cart does not live in our product display component, we're not able to add the product to it. To understand this problem better, let's look at the code. If you're coding along, you can check out L10-start. Because the Add to Cart button lives in the product display component, when it's clicked, it needs to update the value of cart. So how do we get this to happen? We already know that props are a way to pass data down into a component, but what about when something happens within that component, like a button click? How do we let other parts of our app know that that event happened? The answer is to emit that event, telling the parent that it happened. So in our product display component, instead of adding to this.cart, which doesn't exist on the product display component, we can instead say emit and emit an event called add to cart. So when the button is clicked, we're emitting or bubbling up that event. But we need to be listening for that event, so we'll add a listener with add to cart, which, as you can assume, listens for the add to cart event to be emitted. And when it hears it, it can trigger another method called update cart. As it sounds, this function will update the actual cart. So let's implement this solution within our app. When the button is clicked, it triggers the Add to Cart button, which needs to emit the event. And we'll switch that out for emit Add to Cart. But we have to create this emit function. We can create it using define emit with the name of the custom event Add to Cart in the app component. We'll listen for that event on product display, triggering the update cart function, which we'll add in the script. Now let's check this out in the browser. Great, it's working. We click the Add to Cart button, it lets the parent know the event happened, triggering the update cart method. To make our app more realistic, our cart probably shouldn't just be a number. It should be an array that has the IDs of the product that we pushed into it. So let's change things around. So we'll set cart as an array, and then push ID into the cart, which means we need to be accepting ID within this function, which we can have access to when the Add to Cart event is emitted. But we have to pass it as the second parameter. We can copy this up here and grab the ID, much like we're grabbing the image here. This ID is now the payload of the event that we're emitting. So when the update method is triggered, it has access to that payload ID. Now in the browser, you can see that we're adding the product ID into the cart, which is now an array. But we don't need to actually display these IDs, so let's change things up a bit. In the cart expression here, we'll add .length so that we show how many items are in the cart. And that brings us to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Add a new button to product display, which removes the product from the cart. You can check out the ending code at L10-end. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to build forms with Vue. By the end of the lesson, we'll have a form here where users can add product reviews. At the beginning of this course, we learned about vbind, which creates a one-way binding from the ref to the template. When working with forms, however, this one-way binding isn't enough. We also need to be binding from the template to the ref, so that when a user inputs their name into an input, for example, we record and store that value in our data. vModel helps us achieve this, creating two-way data binding. That way, if our ref value changes, the value in our template also changes because of this two-way binding. To see this all in action, we're going to create a new form component. You can check out the starting code at L11-start. Inside of the components directory, we'll create a new component called review form. Inside of here, I'm going to paste in this code. And inside of our template literal, we've got three kinds of inputs: a standard input, a text area, and a select. along with a button we'll use to submit the form. Because we want to bind these form inputs to some reactive state in the script, we'll create the script tag with the setup attribute. Instead of using ref to create the reactive state, we'll use reactive. And add name, content, and rating. Since we're using reactive, we have to import it. Reactive is similar to ref, but it allows us to group related data together in a single variable. Now we can use VModel to create a two-way binding between our template and our reactive state. So on the name input, we'll say VModel equals review.name, creating a binding between these two. On the review text area, we'll say VModel equals review.content. And on the rating select, we'll say vmodel.number equals review.rating. .number here is a modifier that typecasts the value as a number. In order to submit this form, we'll add a listener up here and say @submit.prevent. This is another modifier which prevents the default browser refresh and will trigger the onSubmit method. We'll add this method in the script. And on submit, we'll create a product review object containing name, which equals review.name, content equaling review.content, and rating, which equals review.rating. Now that we've created this product review, we need to send it up because we don't want the reviews to live on the form, we want the reviews to live on the product. So we'll say emit, and emit a review submitted event, passing along the product review as the payload. We have to use define emits for this new custom event. And below here, we'll clear out and reset review.name, review.content, and review.rating. Now that our review form is created, we can import it within product display, nesting it here at the bottom. Now in the browser, we can see the review form and it looks like it's working, except when we click that submit button, we're emitting the event, but we haven't listened for it anywhere. So we need to listen for the review submitted event and then add the review to the product display component. We'll add the listener here on the review form, @review submitted, and when the event happens, we'll trigger a new add review function. It's going to add reviews to our product display component. So we'll add a reviews ref here. Then we'll create the add review function, which takes in the review that we got from that event payload and pushes it into the reviews array. Now that we've implemented the ability to add reviews, we need to be displaying those reviews. So let's create a new component to do that. That component will be called review list. It will have a prop so that it can receive the reviews, which will be of type array and required. And below, I'll paste this template. We'll add a v4 so that we can print out each review from our reviews array, including the index so that we can bind the key attribute to it. And then use expressions to create a sentence that says review.name gave this review.rating stars. In other words, Adam gave this 5 stars. We'll create a break and print out the actual text from that review. Now we can import this component. And we'll add it within product display right above the review form. Adding that reviews prop, and passing in the reviews that live on the product display component. So to, review, we're passing in the reviews into the review list and printing each of them out. Checking this out in the browser, we'll add a new review, click Submit, and there it is being displayed. When there's no reviews to display, we don't need to be showing the review list component, so let's fix that. So here on the review list component, we will only show this if review length is greater than 0. In other words, if the reviews array is empty, we will not show this component. With a refresh, it looks like it's working. And when we add a review, now it is displaying. To finish up this lesson, we're going to add some very basic form validation. So before we create a product review, we're going to check if review.name is blank, or if review.content is blank, or if review.rating is null. If any of these things are the case, we will show an alert which says, review is incomplete, please fill out every field, and then return out of the method. We'll check this out by trying to submit a review that is not fully filled out, and we'll see this alert. But of course, when we fill out every field, we're allowed to add the review. Congratulations, you've made it to the end of our Vue 3 course and completed your first step on your path to Vue Mastery. I invite you to check out our library of other courses that cover all the topics you'll need to succeed as a Vue developer. For your final coding challenge of this course, add a question to the form, would you recommend this product? Record and emit the response in the form. You can check out the ending code at L11-end.